HOA surveyors marked my lake. Before asking who owned it, I thought losing my wife was the hardest thing I'd ever survive. Then an HOA president showed up and decided the lake Sarah and I spent decades protecting belonged to her community. First came the survey flags, then the barges, then a floating restaurant built on water they claimed wasn't mine. They called it progress. I called it theft. But what Karen didn't know was that this lake had a history older than her HOA, older than her permits, and hidden beneath the water was a mistake that would leave every boat trapped and an entire community asking who really owned the truth. Stay with me to the end because this story doesn't finish the way anyone expected. And if you enjoy stories about land, justice, and ordinary people standing their ground with patience instead of anger, take a moment to subscribe. There are plenty more roads, ranches, and HOA battles ahead, and I'd be honored to have you riding along with us. I never expected the biggest fight of my life to start with a few orange survey flags. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 61 years old, and I own a ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Most people around here know me as the guy with the spring-fed lake at the north end of the property. For nearly 3 decades, that lake had been the center of my life. My late wife, Sarah, loved that water more than anything. When we first bought the ranch, the shoreline was overgrown and neglected. We spent years clearing brush, repairing erosion, and protecting the natural springs that fed it. Every fence post, every dock board, every willow tree along the bank carried a memory of her. After Sarah passed away, the lake became the one place where the noise in my head quieted down. That peace lasted until Silver Ridge Estates arrived. The development sat beyond the eastern ridge, a growing neighborhood of expensive homes, manicured lawns, and an HOA that seemed determined to regulate everything it touched. For the first couple of years, we stayed out of each other's way. Then one morning I stepped onto my dock with a cup of coffee and noticed something that didn't belong. Orange survey flags, dozens of them. They stretched along the shoreline near my eastern boundary. I set my coffee down and grabbed my truck keys. By the time I reached the area, 3 men wearing reflective vests were unloading equipment from a trailer. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked. One of them looked up from a tablet. "We're conducting measurements for the Silver Ridge waterfront project." I stared at him. "The what?" "The waterfront project." I pointed toward the lake. "This property belongs to me." The man exchanged a glance with his coworkers. "Sir, we're working from documents provided by the HOA. That answer bothered me more than it should have, not because it made sense, because it didn't. I drove straight to the ranch office and pulled out the property records I kept in a locked cabinet. The deeds were clear. The surveys were clear. The water rights certificates were clear. The lake belonged to me. End of story. Or at least it should have been. 3 days later, the first construction barge arrived. I watched it crawl across the water from the eastern shoreline like an invasion force. Workers began unloading floating sections of dock, metal framework, construction materials, generators. My phone rang before I could drive over. The caller identified herself as Karen Holloway, president of the Silver Ridge Estates, HOA. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Mr. Walker, I wanted to personally inform you about an exciting community project. I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next." "What project?" "The Silver Ridge Floating Restaurant." I thought I misheard her. "The what?" "Our new floating dining venue. It's going to become the centerpiece of the community." I looked out at the workers unloading equipment onto my lake. My lake. There was a brief silence. Then Karen laughed softly. "Actually, that's one of the issues we're currently reviewing." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What does that mean?" It means the ownership status of the waterfront area may not be as straightforward as previously believed. I gripped the phone tighter. I have deeds older than your subdivision. I'm sure you do, she replied. That's why our legal team has been examining the records. Her confidence bothered me. People don't talk like that unless they think they're holding something important or dangerous. The next morning, I drove to the lake before sunrise. More barges had arrived, more workers, more equipment. Someone had already placed temporary markers in the water. The project wasn't being discussed. It was already happening. I stood on the dock Sarah and I had built together and watched strangers measure distances along my shoreline. For the first time since she died, I felt genuinely powerless. Then I noticed Karen. She was standing near the eastern bank speaking with contractors. When she saw me watching, she smiled and lifted a folder. Even from a distance, I could tell what she was doing. She wanted me to see it. A message, a warning, or maybe a promise. Later that afternoon, she finally crossed the property line and approached me directly. She stopped beside the dock and held up the folder. Our attorneys have located documentation that may change everything. I looked at the papers, then at her. What documentation? Karen's smile widened. Documentation showing this lake may belong to the community. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a takeover. I looked at Karen Holloway standing beside my dock, holding that folder like she'd already won. Show me, I said. She opened it just enough for me to glimpse a colored plat map. A thick blue outline surrounded my lake. According to the document, the water had been designated as part of a shared community resource zone connected to Silver Ridge Estates. It was ridiculous. I knew it. She knew it. But the confidence in her expression worried me. Where did this come from? I asked. Our consultants prepared it during a boundary review. That's not an answer. Karen closed the folder. If you have concerns, you're welcome to address them through the appropriate channels. Then she turned and walked away. That same afternoon, I drove into town and visited the county records office. The clerk behind the counter pulled up every property record connected to my parcel. Nothing had changed. The original deeds remained intact. The legal description remained intact. The lake was still entirely inside my property boundary. I left feeling relieved. That feeling lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, 2 county vehicles arrived at the shoreline. A planning official stepped out carrying a clipboard. I met him near the access road. What can I do for you? We've received documentation related to a pending land use review. I crossed my arms. Documentation from Silver Ridge? He nodded. My stomach tightened. What exactly are you reviewing? The HOA has submitted a request involving recreational access and community resource designation. I stared at him. You mean my lake? The official avoided eye contact. It's under review. That phrase became the most infuriating phrase I'd ever heard. Under review. Construction continued. Under review. Anchors appeared in the water. Under review. Barges multiplied. Under review. Nobody would make a decision. Yet somehow everyone allowed the project to move forward. 3 days later, workers began installing the first floating support structures. I drove down to the shoreline and confronted the foreman. Do you have authorization from the property owner? He pointed toward the eastern ridge. We have authorization from the HOA. I'm the property owner. He shrugged. Then that's above my pay grade. I photographed everything. The barges, the equipment, the workers, the coordinates. If this ended up in court, I wanted a complete record. That evening, my neighbor Hank Morrison pulled into my driveway. Hank had lived west of my ranch for almost 20 years. He wasn't the type to gossip. which meant when he showed up unannounced, something mattered. He climbed out of his truck and handed me a coffee. "You've got a problem," he said. I noticed. "No. Bigger than you think." We sat on the tailgate of my pickup while he lowered his voice. "My cousin works maintenance at the Silver Ridge Clubhouse." I waited. "They've been holding private meetings. About the restaurant? About developers." That got my attention. "What developers?" Hank shook his head. "Don't know names, but there have been investors coming in from Denver and Billings." I frowned. "This isn't about a restaurant, is it?" "Nope." He pointed toward the lake. "That's a sales feature." The realization hit me immediately. The restaurant wasn't the goal. The lake was. The development wanted a waterfront attraction, property values, marketing material, new buyers. My lake wasn't being stolen because they needed it. It was being stolen because it was profitable. The next week, things escalated again. Silver Ridge filed additional paperwork with the county. The planning office scheduled a review session. I attended carrying every deed, survey, and water rights certificate I owned. Karen arrived with attorneys, consultants, engineers, presentation boards. The room felt less like a review meeting and more like a campaign launch. One consultant projected a map onto a screen, the same map Karen had shown me, the same blue outline around my lake. People around the room nodded as if they were looking at something official. I stood. "That map is false." The room went quiet. I walked to the front and laid my original survey on the table. "This deed predates Silver Ridge Estates by decades." One of the consultants smiled politely. "Our research indicates historical ambiguities." "There are no ambiguities." Karen leaned back in her chair. "That's your interpretation." My hands tightened around the survey. Then something happened that I couldn't explain. One county employee quietly approached the screen. He stared at the projected map for several seconds. Then he frowned. Just for a moment. A tiny reaction. But I noticed it. Because he looked confused. As if he'd never seen that version before. The meeting ended without resolution. Another review, another delay, another excuse. As I packed my documents, that same county employee slipped past me. Without looking directly at me, he whispered 3 words. "Check the signatures." Then he walked away. I stood frozen. "Check the signatures." I looked back toward Karen. She was smiling while shaking hands with the developers. For the first time, I stopped asking whether the map was wrong and started asking who had created it. Because if the signatures weren't real, this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was something much bigger. The next morning, I filed a formal records request with the county. If someone had altered a map, I wanted every version that existed. 3 days later, a clerk handed me a packet thick enough to stop a bullet. I spent half the afternoon at my kitchen table comparing surveys. The original records matched my deeds. The legal descriptions matched my deeds. The tax parcels matched my deeds. Only one document was different. The new map. The same map Karen kept waving around. The same map being used to justify construction on my lake. What bothered me most wasn't the boundary line. It was the approval block. The signatures looked scanned, copied, inserted. I wasn't a forensic expert, but I'd spent enough years reviewing infrastructure contracts to recognize when something felt wrong. I called the county office. Nobody returned the call. Meanwhile, construction accelerated. The floating restaurant had moved beyond planning. It was becoming real. More barges arrived. More workers appeared. Steel pilings were driven into the lakebed. Large floating sections were connected together near the eastern shoreline. Every morning, I woke up to new equipment sitting on water that legally belonged to me. Then, the public campaign started. A week later, I opened my mailbox and found the latest Silver Ridge Estates newsletter. The front page headline stopped me cold. "Welcome to Silver Ridge Lake." I read it twice, then a third time. My lake, renamed in a newsletter, as if ownership could be changed by a graphic designer. The article described the future floating restaurant, boat rentals, seasonal events, and community gatherings. Not once did it mention me. Not once did it mention private ownership. According to the newsletter, the lake had always been part of Silver Ridge's vision. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Something worse. Erasure. They weren't trying to buy the lake. They were trying to rewrite its history. Within days, the new name spread everywhere. Social media posts, community pages, real estate advertisements, even local business accounts. Silver Ridge Lake, Silver Ridge Waterfront, Silver Ridge Floating Restaurant. Each post made it easier for people to forget the truth. I became the obstacle, the man standing in the way of progress. At the feed store, conversations stopped when I walked in. At the diner, people lowered their voices. One afternoon, I overheard two men discussing the project. "That old rancher should just sell." "Yeah. HOA probably owns it anyway." Neither knew I was sitting 3 stools away. The lie was working. The following weekend, I drove to the eastern shoreline and found Karen supervising construction. Workers were unloading decorative railings. A photographer was taking promotional pictures. I walked straight toward her. "You renamed my lake." Karen barely looked up. "We renamed a community asset." "No. You renamed private property." She smiled for the camera before turning back toward me. "The community disagrees. The law doesn't." She folded her arms. "The law is currently under review." There it was again. That phrase, under review, as if uncertainty somehow erased ownership. I looked past her toward the growing structure floating on the water. "You're building a restaurant based on a disputed claim. We're building a future." I left before I said something I'd regret, because I was beginning to understand her strategy. Karen didn't need to win legally yet. She only needed people to believe she'd already won, and every day that passed made that easier. A few evenings later, I returned home after checking fences on the western pasture. Something white was sticking out of my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was another newsletter. It wasn't. It was a plain envelope with no stamp, no return address, no note. Nothing except a single sheet of paper. Printed in the center was a reference number. Just a number. No explanation, no signature, no message. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I recognized part of it. The formatting looked familiar. Engineering records, infrastructure records, the kind of numbering system used on old county projects. My pulse quickened. I walked inside and spread the paper across my kitchen table. Somewhere I'd seen that number before. Somewhere connected to the lake. Somewhere long before Silver Ridge Estates existed. And if my memory was right, whatever that number referred to had been buried for decades. I suddenly understood one thing. Someone was trying to tell me something. The question was why, and who. The next morning, I drove straight to the storage barn. If that reference number meant what I thought it meant, the answer wasn't sitting in a county office. It was sitting somewhere among the boxes Sarah and I had never fully unpacked after her parents passed away. Most of the records from her family had been stored there for years. Old ranch documents, property surveys, engineering papers, things nobody had looked at in decades. I spent nearly 3 hours opening boxes. Nothing. Then I found a weathered cardboard tube tucked behind an old filing cabinet. The label stopped me cold. Walker Family Water Management Project, 1971. I carried it outside and carefully unrolled the contents on a workbench. The reference number from the anonymous envelope appeared immediately in the bottom corner. My pulse jumped. The number wasn't random. It belonged to a complete engineering plan. I turned page after page. Cross-sections, elevation charts, flow diagrams, inspection approvals. Then I found the signature. Sarah's grandfather, Harold Jensen, a civil engineer. Suddenly pieces started falling into place. Long before Silver Ridge Estates existed, Harold had helped design a water management system for the lake. Not a dam, not a reservoir. A control system. One built to protect surrounding land during droughts and seasonal flooding. The system included hidden channels, emergency overflow routes, and a mechanical regulation structure located along the eastern shoreline, exactly where Karen's contractors were building. I stared at the plans for nearly an hour. The more I read, the more dangerous the HOA project looked. The floating restaurant wasn't sitting on ordinary water. It was sitting on top of infrastructure they didn't even know existed. That afternoon, I made a call. Claire Dawson answered on the second ring. I'd known Claire for years. She specialized in land use disputes and water right cases. If anyone could make sense of what was happening, it was her. 2 days later, she arrived at the ranch carrying a legal pad and a briefcase. She spent less than 10 minutes studying the plans before looking up. Where did you get these? Sarah's family records. Claire leaned back. These are real, I figured. No, Ethan. You don't understand. She tapped the blueprint. This system predates Silver Ridge by over 50 years. My stomach tightened. Meaning every permit they filed should have disclosed this infrastructure. I felt the first spark of hope I'd felt in months. Claire kept reading. Then her expression changed. What is it? She pointed at a section of notes attached to the engineering approval. The county required permanent protection of the Eastern Control Corridor. I frowned. The Eastern Shoreline? Exactly. The same shoreline currently occupied by barges, floating supports, and construction equipment. Claire looked up. If they built on top of a protected control corridor without disclosure, that's a serious problem. For the first time, Karen's confidence started making sense. She wasn't acting like someone who knew the truth. She was acting like someone who had never bothered to find it. The following week, Claire began digging into the HOA permits. What she found made things even worse. Several engineering reports were missing. Environmental reviews had been marked incomplete. One application referenced shoreline conditions that didn't match current county records. Then she found something that stopped both of us. A permit amendment submitted just 6 months earlier. The amendment contained diagrams of the lake, but the diagrams excluded the control corridor entirely. It was as if the infrastructure didn't exist. Can they do that? I asked. Claire shook her head. Not legally. The power dynamic was beginning to shift. For weeks I had been reacting, defending, explaining, trying to stop something already moving. Now I finally possessed information Karen didn't. Something real. Something documented. Something older than every house in Silver Ridge Estates. That evening I drove to the eastern shoreline. Construction continued. Workers moved steel sections across floating platforms. Generators hummed. Karen stood near the water speaking with contractors. She noticed me watching. Her smile returned, the same confident smile she'd worn since this started. But this time it didn't bother me. Because for the first time since the takeover began, I knew something she didn't. The lake had rules older than her HOA, older than her permits, older than her lawyers. And if those rules still worked the way Harold Jensen designed them to work, then Silver Ridge Estates wasn't building on top of victory. They were building on top of a mistake. Unfortunately, knowing that didn't stop the HOA from accelerating its attack. If anything, the pressure increased. A week after Claire discovered the permit discrepancies, Silver Ridge Estates launched what I can only describe as a public relations war. It started with another newsletter. The headline read, "Protecting Community Progress." I wasn't mentioned by name. I didn't need to be. The article described a local landowner who was obstructing development, spreading misinformation, and threatening a project designed to benefit families and local businesses. Every resident knew exactly who they meant. The next edition was worse. This time they included artist renderings of the completed floating restaurant. Happy families. Boats tied to elegant docks. Children fishing from floating platforms. The message was obvious. I wasn't standing against the HOA. I was standing against everyone's future. The lie spread fast. At the hardware store, conversations stopped when I walked in. At the diner, I overheard people discussing legal action against that stubborn rancher. A few residents even drove past my property just to take photos. Some posted them online. One caption read, "One man shouldn't own an entire lake." I saved screenshots of everything. Every article. Every social media post. Every newsletter. Claire had advised me to document everything, so I did. Meanwhile, construction moved into its final stages. The floating restaurant was becoming impossible to ignore. Large sections of decking were now connected. Exterior framing was complete. New signs appeared near the entrance road. Coming soon. The floating restaurant at Silver Ridge Lake. Every time I saw those words, I felt the same frustration. Not because they were building, because they were pretending ownership already existed. Then the anonymous flyers appeared. I found the first one taped to a gas pump. The second was pinned to a community bulletin board. By the end of the week, they were everywhere. Stop the greed. Support progress. According to the flyer, a private landowner was preventing economic growth and trying to monopolize resources meant for the community. No signature. No organization listed. But everyone knew where they came from. Karen never got her hands dirty directly. That was part of what made her dangerous. She always left room for plausible deniability. The next escalation arrived in my mailbox. Certified mail. Silver Ridge Estates, HOA Legal Counsel. I already knew it wouldn't contain good news. Inside was a formal notice. According to the letter, I was prohibited from interfering with construction activities, approaching contractors, or entering designated development zones surrounding the restaurant project. I read the document twice, then a third time. The designated development zones included portions of my shoreline. My shoreline. They were effectively warning me to stay away from my own property. I immediately called Claire. 20 minutes later, she was reading the letter herself. Her expression darkened. "This is aggressive. Can they do this?" "No." I felt a wave of relief. Then she continued, "But they'll try." Claire pointed toward several paragraphs. "They're creating a paper trail." "For what?" "So they can paint you as the problem." The realization hit immediately. Everything suddenly fit together. The newsletters, the flyers, the legal notice, the social media campaign. Karen wasn't trying to win the ownership battle yet. She was preparing the public to believe I deserved to lose it. That evening, I drove down to the lake. Construction lights reflected across the water. Workers were installing decorative lighting along the floating walkways. The restaurant looked almost finished. Karen stood near the shoreline talking with investors. When she noticed me, she smiled. The same confident smile, the same certainty. For months she had controlled the narrative. But now I knew something she didn't. I had evidence. I had the blueprints, and Claire was uncovering more discrepancies every week. The question wasn't whether Karen was hiding something anymore. The question was how much. My phone buzzed. A text message from Claire. 3 words. You need this. Attached was a photograph. A county filing. Recently obtained. I zoomed in. Then my pulse quickened. The document showed that part of the restaurant approval had been submitted under a temporary authorization scheduled to expire before the grand opening. Karen's entire project was balancing on paperwork that might already be falling apart. And for the first time since this began, I realized the pressure wasn't only on me anymore. It was on her. The problem was that Karen Holloway didn't act like someone under pressure. She acted like someone celebrating a victory. Over the next 2 weeks, Silver Ridge Estates turned the floating restaurant into the center of every conversation in the county. Advertisements appeared online. Local radio stations mentioned the grand opening. A regional lifestyle magazine published a feature about Wyoming's newest waterfront destination. Nobody asked who owned the waterfront. By then, the narrative was already set. The floating restaurant was presented as a community achievement. Karen was presented as a visionary, and I was barely mentioned at all. Claire kept digging. Every few days she called with another inconsistency, another missing disclosure, another permit issue. The problem was timing. None of it was moving fast enough. Government agencies worked in weeks. Karen worked in days. The restaurant kept growing. The floating platforms were now fully connected. Decorative lighting lined the walkways. Dozens of boat slips extended from the main structure. Contractors installed railings, signage, and landscaping along the eastern shoreline. Millions of dollars had already been poured into the project. That was Karen's real strategy. Build first, argue later. The more money invested, the harder it became for anyone to stop it. One afternoon, I drove to the county planning office. I requested an update on the ownership review. The answer was the same one I'd heard for months. Still under review. I walked out more frustrated than ever. Halfway across the parking lot, my phone rang. It was Tyler Reed. Until then, Tyler had been little more than a name attached to HOA board minutes. I answered anyway. Ethan? His voice sounded nervous. Yes. I can't talk long. I stopped walking. What is it? They know people are asking questions. My pulse quickened. Who knows? The board. I leaned against my truck. What questions? The permits. The ownership dispute. The control corridor. That got my attention immediately. I hadn't publicly mentioned the control corridor. Very few people knew it existed. How do you know about that? I asked. Silence. Then Tyler spoke again. Because Karen had a meeting about it. The air seemed to leave my lungs. What meeting? A closed board meeting. What was said? Another pause. She told everyone the issue wasn't important. My grip tightened on the phone. And they believed her? Most did. Most. Not all. Then Tyler lowered his voice. Be careful, Ethan. The line disconnected. For several seconds I stood there staring at the screen. The call confirmed something important. Karen knew more than she'd admitted. Much more. That evening I forwarded the information to Claire. Her response arrived 10 minutes later. Interesting. That was all she wrote. But I knew what it meant. The legal landscape was shifting. Someone inside the HOA was getting nervous. Meanwhile, Karen pushed forward with the grand opening. Invitations went out to investors. County officials received VIP access. Local news crews confirmed attendance. A large banner appeared across the restaurant entrance. Grand opening this Saturday. The entire development buzzed with excitement. Dozens of boats arrived throughout the week. Residents decorated slips. Families posted countdown photos. Karen gave interviews beside the water. In every interview, she repeated the same phrase. "This lake belongs to the community." Each time I heard it, I saved the recording. Claire told me to keep collecting evidence, so I did. Then something happened that neither Karen nor I could control. A major spring storm system appeared on the forecast. The prediction wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant. Several days of steady rainfall across the watershed, enough to raise water levels, enough to activate natural drainage patterns, enough to make me pull Harold Jensen's blueprints from the cabinet once again. I spread the plans across my kitchen table, every note, every elevation marker, every flow diagram. I studied them for hours. The emergency lake management system had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. Not disaster, adjustment, control, protection. Outside, the first rain clouds were already gathering beyond the western ridge. Across the lake, lights from the floating restaurant reflected on the water. Everything looked perfect. Investors were arriving. Residents were celebrating. Karen was preparing for the biggest day of her career. And beneath all of it sat a 50-year-old system nobody had bothered to understand. By Friday evening, the rain finally began. Slow, steady, relentless. I stood on the dock watching ripples spread across the surface. The floating restaurant glowed in the distance. Music drifted from the shoreline as workers prepared for opening day. My phone buzzed. A weather alert. Additional rainfall expected overnight. I looked from the screen to the lake, then toward the eastern shoreline, toward the hidden infrastructure Sarah's grandfather had designed decades earlier. For months, Karen had treated the lake like a decorative backdrop. By morning, the lake would have something to say about that. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried, because I wanted to be absolutely certain. Around midnight, I reviewed Harold Jensen's blueprints one final time. The emergency lake management system wasn't a weapon. That distinction mattered. It had been legally approved decades earlier. Its purpose was simple: regulate water levels and protect the watershed during periods of unusual inflow. The approaching storm qualified. Everything I was about to do fell within the original operating guidelines. At 3 a.m, I drove to the eastern shoreline. The rain had become steady. Water levels were rising. I parked near a stand of trees and walked to the concealed access point shown on Harold's plans. The structure was still there, hidden beneath vegetation and years of neglect. Exactly where the blueprints said it would be. I opened the access cover. Inside sat the original control mechanism. Old, weathered, but functional. For several minutes, I inspected every component. Then I activated the system exactly as Harold's instructions specified. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosion. No sudden rush of water. The system simply began doing what it had been designed to do, restoring the lake to its natural operating condition. I closed the access cover and drove home. Then I waited. By sunrise, the first signs appeared. The lake level had shifted. Not drastically, just enough. The emergency channels beneath the eastern corridor reopened. Natural flow patterns returned. Water began moving through pathways that had been ignored during the restaurant's construction. And that was where Karen's problem started. The floating restaurant had been designed around assumptions. Assumptions about water depth. Assumptions about shoreline stability. Assumptions about lake behavior. Those assumptions were wrong. At 6:14 a.m., my phone rang. It was Hank Morrison. "Ethan." His voice sounded stunned. "You seeing this?" I was already standing on my dock. "I am." Across the lake, chaos was unfolding. Several boats tied to the restaurant's docking system had stopped moving properly. The slips were no longer aligned. One floating walkway had shifted sideways. Workers were running across the structure, pointing at something beneath the water. Another boat appeared wedged against a support frame. Then another. The changing water flow wasn't sinking anything. It was exposing design flaws. By 7 o'clock, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Dozens of residents gathered near the shoreline. Contractors rushed between docks. People shouted instructions. Nobody seemed to understand why the marina layout was suddenly failing. Then Karen arrived. Even from across the lake, I could tell she was furious. She marched down the shoreline barking orders. Several contractors pointed toward the water. Others pointed toward engineering diagrams. The arguments were visible even from a distance. Meanwhile, the problem continued spreading. As water followed its historic routes, sediment shifted beneath portions of the docking network. Several slips twisted out of alignment. Additional boats became trapped. Some could no longer enter. Others couldn't leave. The restaurant's grand opening traffic plan collapsed within hours. Everything had been designed around conditions that no longer existed, conditions the lake had never promised to maintain. My phone rang again. This time it was Claire. "Tell me you're watching." "I am. I just received 3 calls." "From who?" "Investors." That surprised me. "Investors?" "They want to know whether the ownership dispute is real." I looked across the lake. Finally, the right people were asking the right questions. By mid-morning, local news crews had arrived. The grand opening wasn't being filmed anymore. The malfunction was. Cameras pointed toward stranded boats. Crowds gathered along the shoreline. Questions spread faster than answers. Karen attempted to address reporters. I watched her stand before microphones. Watched her insist the situation was temporary. Watched her promise engineers were evaluating the problem. Then one reporter asked a question. A simple question. "Who owns the lake?" Karen hesitated. Only for a second. But everyone saw it. That hesitation traveled through the crowd like electricity. For months, she had projected certainty. Now, uncertainty was visible. And once people see uncertainty, they start asking questions. The situation escalated again shortly after noon. A county inspector arrived. Then another. By early afternoon, vehicles from multiple agencies lined the entrance road. People were no longer celebrating. They were investigating. As I stood on the dock, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. Unknown number. Only one sentence. "Karen says you sabotaged the project." I stared at the message. Then another arrived. "She's demanding criminal charges." I looked back toward the floating restaurant, toward the trapped boats, toward the crowds, toward the reporters. Karen was about to make the biggest mistake of her entire campaign, because accusations required evidence, and evidence was the one thing she didn't have. By late afternoon, the atmosphere around the lake had completely changed. 24 hours earlier, people had been preparing for a celebration. Now, they were demanding explanations. The restaurant remained open physically, but operationally, it was a disaster. Several boat slips were unusable. Multiple vessels remained trapped inside sections of the marina. Contractors were scrambling to redesign docking access, while frustrated residents crowded the shoreline. Karen spent the entire afternoon moving between reporters, engineers, and attorneys. Every conversation seemed more tense than the last. I stayed exactly where I had been all day, on my dock, watching, listening, waiting. The first official visit came shortly before sunset. A county sheriff's truck pulled into my driveway. Sheriff Ben Carter stepped out. I had known Ben for years. He wasn't the type to waste time. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. "Not at all." We sat on the tailgate of my truck. Ben got straight to the point. Karen filed a complaint. I nodded. Figured she would. She claims you interfered with the project. Did she provide evidence? Ben sighed. No. That answer told me everything. If she had evidence, he wouldn't be asking questions. He'd be presenting it. Instead, he asked me to explain what happened. So I did. I showed him the blueprints, the water management system, the county approvals dating back decades, the maintenance records. Every document. Ben spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing everything. Finally, he closed the folder. This system is legal? Completely. It was activated according to its intended purpose? Yes. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. You're not the only person getting questions. What do you mean? The county is getting flooded with calls. Residents, investors, contractors, media outlets. Everybody wanted answers. The problem was that nobody seemed to have them, except maybe the lake itself. The following morning, a convoy of county vehicles arrived. One of them belonged to Rachel Morgan. I recognized her name immediately. County water engineer. The exact person Claire had hoped would eventually get involved. Rachel stepped out carrying a field tablet and several inspection binders. Unlike everyone else, she didn't go to the restaurant first. She went directly to the shoreline. Then she started asking questions. Hard questions. Questions nobody had asked during construction. Where were the original hydrology studies? Who approved the marina design? What assumptions had been used regarding seasonal flow patterns? Why was protected infrastructure absent from submitted diagrams? The last question caused visible discomfort among the contractors. I noticed because several people suddenly stopped talking. Rachel noticed too. By noon, she had requested access to permit records. By 1 o'clock, she had requested engineering submissions. By 2 o'clock, she was interviewing project managers individually. The mood around the lake became strangely quiet. Not calm, uneasy. The kind of silence that appears when people realize an investigation has become serious. Then Claire called. I just got off the phone with Rachel. That surprised me. Already? She moves fast. I waited. Claire lowered her voice. Ethan, she found something. My pulse quickened. What? Multiple permit documents contain inconsistencies. I sat up straighter. What kind of inconsistencies? Different versions of the same filings. That sounded familiar. Very familiar. The map? Possibly. Claire paused. She's comparing submission records right now. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the county wasn't looking at me. They were looking at Karen. That distinction mattered. By late afternoon, Rachel's team began marking sections of shoreline with survey stakes. Measurements were taken, coordinates verified, historical records reviewed. Every hour seemed to produce another question, and every question led back to the same place. Silver Ridge Estates. That evening, I received another call, this time from Tyler Reed. His voice sounded different, less nervous, more resigned. They're panicking. I didn't need to ask who he meant. The board? All of them. I looked across the lake toward the restaurant. Construction crews were already removing portions of temporary infrastructure, trying to fix something they still didn't understand. Tyler spoke again. Rachel found things. What things? Silence. Then, things Karen never told us. Before I could ask another question, he hung up. I stared at the darkening shoreline. The power shift was happening. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. For months, Karen had controlled the narrative. Now the questions belonged to someone else. And when Rachel Morgan started pulling on loose threads, entire stories had a habit of coming apart. 3 days later, the first crack appeared. Not in the restaurant, not in the docks, in the HOA itself. I was sitting in Claire Dawson's office when she received an email. She opened it, read it once, then leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said quietly, "that's interesting." I knew that tone. What happened? Claire turned her monitor toward me. The sender's name made my eyebrows rise. Tyler Reed. Attached were 6 internal HOA documents, meeting notes, board communications, private correspondence, the kind of records Karen never expected anyone outside the HOA to see. "Is this real?" I asked. Claire was already reading. "Oh, it's real." The first document was a meeting summary from 6 months earlier. Karen had addressed concerns about ownership. Several board members questioned whether the lake actually belonged to Silver Ridge Estates. Her response was short. "Ownership status remains unresolved, but project momentum must continue." I stared at the sentence. She knew. Months before construction began, she knew. The second document was even worse. It contained legal concerns raised by a consulting firm. The consultant explicitly warned that construction should be delayed until ownership verification was completed. Karen's handwritten response appeared beside the recommendation. "Proceed as planned." My stomach tightened. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Claire printed every page. "We're submitting all of this. To Rachel? Rachel. The county. Anyone involved." For months, Karen had portrayed herself as a community leader acting in good faith. Now there was evidence showing otherwise, and that evidence was multiplying. Later that afternoon, Rachel called me directly. It was the first time we'd spoken. "Ethan. Rachel. I need to verify a few things." Her voice was calm and professional, but I could hear urgency underneath it. For nearly 40 minutes, we reviewed timelines, permit submissions, property records, engineering documents. When we finished, Rachel was silent for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. "Your records are consistent." I knew exactly what that meant. Others weren't. The next revelation arrived the following morning. Rachel's investigation uncovered multiple versions of the disputed plat map. Multiple versions. The same map Karen had used to justify construction. The same map shown at public meetings. The same map presented as official. Several revisions contained different approval histories, different notations, different authorization records. Someone had been modifying documents during the review process. The county immediately launched a formal inquiry. News spread fast, much faster than Karen could control. By that evening, local reporters were asking direct questions. Had Silver Ridge Estates knowingly submitted inaccurate information? Had project approvals been obtained under false representations? Why had construction continued despite unresolved ownership disputes? The interviews became painful to watch. Karen tried answering, then tried avoiding answers, then stopped appearing altogether. Residents noticed. Investors noticed. Everyone noticed. The woman who had spent months standing in front of cameras suddenly disappeared. Meanwhile, Tyler Reed agreed to provide formal testimony. Claire arranged the meeting. Tyler arrived carrying a folder. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" I asked. He looked down. "Because I believed her." That answer carried more weight than any legal argument. Karen hadn't only misled officials, she'd misled her own board. Tyler opened the folder. Inside were email chains, dozens of them. One particular message froze the room. It had been sent by Karen to several board members weeks before construction began. The ownership issue won't matter once the project is operational. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Claire finally broke the silence. That one alone may change everything. And she was right. Because intent matters. Mistakes can be defended. Misjudgment can be explained. But knowingly pushing forward despite unresolved ownership? That was different. That was exactly what Rachel had been looking for. By the end of the week, the county's position changed dramatically. The investigation expanded. The permit review expanded. The ownership dispute expanded. For the first time since the floating restaurant appeared on my lake, the burden of explanation shifted. Not onto me, onto Karen. And she was running out of answers. Then Claire called with the update we'd been waiting for. The county is forwarding everything. Everything? Everything. I already knew what came next. Court. The fight was finally moving into a place where facts mattered more than narratives. And for the first time since Karen stepped onto my property, I wasn't preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to prove she knew exactly what she was doing all along. The court hearing began 6 weeks later. By then, the story had spread far beyond Silver Ridge Estates. What started as an HOA dispute had become a county-wide discussion about property rights, accountability, and abuse of authority. The courtroom was packed. Residents filled the gallery. Reporters occupied the back rows. Even people who had once supported Karen showed up to hear the evidence for themselves. Claire Dawson arrived carrying 3 boxes of documents: every deed, every survey, every permit filing, every email, every engineering record. Months earlier, I had been the man nobody wanted to listen to. Now everyone was listening. Karen entered with her attorneys and took a seat across the room. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't look confident. She looked tired. The evidence unfolded over 2 days. Rachel Morgan testified first. She walked the court through the engineering history of the lake, the control corridor, the water management system, the permit discrepancies, the missing disclosures, the multiple versions of the disputed plat map. Her testimony was calm, methodical, and devastating. Then came Tyler Reed. He described private board meetings, warnings that had been ignored, questions that had been dismissed, emails that had never been disclosed publicly. When Claire introduced Karen's message, the ownership issue won't matter once the project is operational, the courtroom became completely silent. Intent. That was what the case had always been about. Not confusion, not misunderstanding. Intent. The final blow came when county records specialists verified that the disputed map had undergone unauthorized modifications during the review process. No one could establish a legitimate basis for the revisions. The map that had launched the entire takeover collapsed under scrutiny. By the end of the second day, the outcome felt inevitable. 3 weeks later, the judge issued the ruling. The court confirmed that the lake remained entirely within my property boundaries. The HOA's claims were rejected. The disputed filings were invalidated. Silver Ridge Estates was ordered to remove all remaining structures connected to the floating restaurant project. The HOA was also required to fund environmental restoration efforts for the affected shoreline. Then came Karen. The court found that material facts had been withheld during portions of the approval process. Separate proceedings would determine her personal liability. But her position as HOA president was already finished. She resigned before the month ended. The woman who had spent months presenting herself as the voice of the community disappeared almost overnight. What surprised people most was what happened next. It wasn't about money. There were settlement discussions, damage calculations, legal fees, property claims. But none of those things mattered to me as much as something else. One afternoon, Claire asked a simple question. If you could ask for one thing beyond the ruling, what would it be? I already knew the answer. The lake had never officially carried a name. Not legally, not on county records. To most agencies, it was simply a parcel designation, a number, a technical description. But to Sarah and me, it had always been something more. So Claire filed one final petition. Months later, approval arrived. The designation became official. Sarah's Lake. I stood on the dock holding the letter for a long time before folding it carefully and placing it inside my jacket. The floating restaurant was gone by then. The damaged docks were gone. The construction barges were gone. The signs were gone. Even the temporary fencing had disappeared. One by one, the pieces of the takeover vanished. The lake remained, as it always had. The restoration work continued through the summer. Native vegetation returned to the shoreline. Wildlife slowly reappeared. The water cleared. The silence returned. Not the silence of isolation. The silence of peace. Something else changed too. Silver Ridge Estates changed. A new HOA board took over. They stopped talking about ownership, stopped talking about development, stopped talking about expansion. Instead, they started talking about stewardship. One afternoon, the new board president asked to meet with me. His name was Mark Delaney. He shook my hand and looked directly at me. We should have listened sooner. I nodded. Neither of us said much after that. There wasn't much left to say. The truth had already done the talking. Months later, I found myself standing on the dock at sunrise. The same dock Sarah and I had built together. The same dock where this fight had started. The water stretched across the ranch, calm and clear. A pair of herons moved across the shoreline. The first light reflected off the surface. For a moment, everything felt exactly the way it used to. Not because nothing had changed, because the right things had survived. The HOA lost the restaurant. Karen lost her position. The developers lost their investment. The false claims disappeared. But Sarah's Lake remained. And standing there in the quiet morning light, I realized something. I hadn't spent all those months fighting for property. I had been fighting for memory, for truth, for the right to protect something that mattered. The lake wasn't valuable because it could host restaurants. It wasn't valuable because it could increase property values. It wasn't valuable because someone could profit from it. It was valuable because it belonged somewhere. It carried history, legacy, love. And some things are worth defending precisely because they cannot be replaced. The water remained still as the sun rose higher above the Wyoming hills. For the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left to prove, only something left to preserve. Sarah's Lake, exactly where it belonged.
If there's one lesson I took from all of this, it's that change doesn't always move fast, but it's matter that you keep holding on to it. There were moments when I felt like the paperwork didn't matter, the history didn't matter, and even the people around me had stopped listening. But facts have a way of surviving when opinion change. What protected that lake in the end wasn't anger or force. It was patience, recourse, persistence, and the willingness to keep showing up with the truth. And maybe that's something worth remembering beyond this story. Something in life isn't valuable because they are expensive. They are valuable because of the memory attached to them, the people connected to them, and the responsibility we feel to protect them. Whether it's a piece of land, a family home, or a promise you make to someone you love. Standing your ground with dignity can matter more than winning an argument. Now I love to hear from you. If you believe something are worth protecting no matter how long it takes, type yes in the comments. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where you had to patiently stand up for what was right, share your story below. I read as many comments as I can, and I love to know where you're watching from too. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, land, justice, and ordinary people finding the courage to stand firm, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories waiting just down the road, and I'll be glad to help you along for the journey.